Hey guys, tonight we're starting with a story that drifts in like a feather through an open window. You know that moment just before sleep when the room feels hushed and the air itself seems like it's holding its breath? That's where we'll begin. Except, well, with actual feathers falling through twilight skies. They float lazily, like they've got nowhere urgent to be, which honestly is a life goal most of us could get behind. And yeah, full disclosure, you probably won't survive this tale. Not in the tragic sense, don't worry, but in the way a cozy couch and a blanket will win out long before we reach the ending. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always a little magical to think about people all over the world sharing the same bedtime story at once. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander through a dusky field, and above you the sky is caught between violet and gray. Out of nowhere, 3 feathers tumble down. Not the kind you'd find stuck to an old pillow, but large, gleaming things, each catching the fading light differently. One glows faintly gold, the second shines silver, and the third seems to hold no color at all, like moonlight trying to be invisible. They don't fall in a hurry. Instead, they descend slowly, deliberately, as though they want you to notice them, to wonder what strange errand they're on. Folklorists like to say that when feathers appear in stories, they almost always mark destiny at play. The Brothers Grimm even slipped feathers into several of their tales, often as a signal that a seemingly weak character would carry the strongest heart. Yet historians still argue whether these feathers symbolize divine guidance, simple chance, or, my personal favorite, the lazy scribblings of a bored medieval monk doodling in the margins. You bend down to touch the nearest one, and it's warm. Not just warm, breathing warm, like it's alive, which is unsettling. If a feather's pulsing, you'd probably want to throw it away and call pest control. But here, under the twilight sky, you don't. You pocket it, the way you might keep a coin you found on the street, secretly hoping it brings luck, even though you know it's mostly just dirty metal. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a castle hums with quiet anticipation. Inside, an aging king, wrinkles drawn deep like rivers across parchment, has decided he must choose his successor. Traditionally, this would be handled with pomp, pageantry, maybe even a jousting tournament. But this king is tired of jousts. Too much clanging, not enough napping. So instead, he whispers an odd decree. His 3 sons will follow wherever a feather falls, and there they must find their fates. A feather toss instead of a coronation. It sounds almost whimsical until you remember thrones aren't exactly beanbags. Here's the quirky tidbit. In actual 16th century Germany, kings sometimes staged absurd tests to determine worthiness, though rarely with feathers. One chronicler even records a Bavarian duke who tested his heirs by having them race pigs. Yes, pigs around the courtyard. Folklorists can't agree if stories like The 3 Feathers grew from these real absurdities, or if peasants invented them as quiet satire, gently poking fun at rulers who treated destiny like a game of dice. As twilight deepens, you hear a soft sound, like a sigh carried on the wind. The golden feather flutters east, the silver feather floats west, and the pale, almost invisible feather drifts straight downward, landing gently at your feet. You glance toward the direction of the others, both shining brightly as they streak toward the distance, promising adventure. But this one doesn't move at all. And here's where the quiet sun enters. the one no one notices, the one who stays silent during family dinners, who doesn't boast, doesn't strut, doesn't flex about the size of his horse or how many maidens allegedly swooned when he walked past the well. Instead, his feather, your feather, lands right here. No sweeping adventure, just a whisper that something deeper hides beneath your feet. And if life has taught you anything, it's that sometimes the smallest, most boring-looking option ends up being the most extraordinary. Like that one time you ordered just soup and got the best meal of your life. So you stand there in the quiet dusk, your feather warm in your palm, realizing that this choice, this very quiet choice, might shape kingdoms, and maybe even the way you dream tonight.
The castle feels older than time itself, and you can almost hear the stone walls sighing as the king's decree spreads like ripples across a pond. Servants scurry down hallways with whispers, courtiers lean in to gossip, and somewhere a minstrel strums his lute in anticipation of whatever chaos feathers might bring. You trail after the announcement, amused that the fate of a kingdom is being settled not by war or coin or marriage alliances, but by the airborne antics of a few bird accessories. Imagine a modern CEO saying, whichever intern catches the floating post-it gets promoted. Yeah, about that level of logic. The king sits high on his carved wooden throne, a faint grin hidden beneath his white beard. His eyes carry that sleepy sparkle of someone who's been around long enough to know that life rarely makes sense, so why not lean into it? He summons his sons, 3 young men, all different shades of pride. The eldest strides forward first, shoulders back, jaw clenched in permanent smugness. He's the sort who believes destiny is already engraved in his jawline. He looks at the golden feather darting east and grins. East means wealth. East wants opportunity. He barely waits for permission before marching toward it, as though the feather itself should be grateful he's chosen to follow. The middle son steps next, laughing loud enough to echo through the rafters. He's the kind who believes every tavern has a chair with his name on it, and that applause is a basic human right. He catches sight of the silver feather twirling westward. Silver means songs, fame, admiration. He smirks, tips an imaginary hat to the court, and sets off in theatrical fashion. And then there's the youngest. Quiet. Always a little slower to speak. His words wade like pebbles before they leave his lips. You notice how his brothers barely acknowledge him. They assume the crown is already a 2-horse race, and the quiet one is, well, more like the stable boy trailing along behind. His feather, the pale one, hasn't flown anywhere. It drifted lazily down, landing right outside the castle doors. To anyone else, it looks like a joke, a failed toss. But to him, well, you see it in his eyes, it feels deliberate. Folklorists point out that many European tales hinge on the third son, the one everyone dismisses. He's often called the simpleton, though not always because he lacks wit. Sometimes it's because he sees the world differently. Scholars argue whether this reflects old village humor, mocking the arrogant eldest sons, or whether it's a coded moral about humility. Either way, history's packed with stories where the youngest, least likely hero turns out to carry the crown. Here's your quirky tidbit. In medieval courts, the third-born son often had no inheritance waiting for him. The first took land, the second might find the clergy, and the third, well, he was often left to seek fortune. Some did, some didn't, but in the folk imagination, that made them the perfect candidates for impossible quests. The king announces the rules. Each son must follow where his feather lands. Whatever they discover will reveal who deserves the throne. No jousts, no debates, just feathers. He leans back in his throne with a look that suggests he's enjoying this far too much. The brothers leave in different directions, each puffed up with expectation. The eldest strides eastward, already rehearsing victory speeches. The middle one heads west with a spring in his step, humming loud enough to wake owls. The youngest lingers. His feather rests on the cobblestones like a piece of forgotten parchment, shimmering faintly in the dying light. You crouch beside him, feeling the odd weight of silence. It's awkward, like when you open a fridge expecting leftovers and find nothing but pickles. But then the wind shifts, just slightly, and the feather flutters against the ground, pointing not out toward the wide world, but downward, as if insisting the answer is beneath the very earth you stand on. The youngest prince tilts his head, almost amused. He doesn't rush, he doesn't pout, he simply notices. And you realize that maybe his greatest strength isn't boldness or wit, but patience, the ability to wait until the world reveals its quieter secrets. Historians still argue whether this feather test in Grimm's story was intended as pure comedy, a bumbling king using nonsense, or if it hides an allegory about inner worth. Personally, I like to imagine the storytellers laughing around a fire saying, "Wouldn't it be funny if the hero's quest was literally in the backyard?" And so, as the sky deepens to indigo, the quiet prince follows his feather, not across mountains, not through kingdoms, but to the ground beneath his very feet. And that is where the true journey begins. The eldest prince's boots crunch loudly on gravel as he sets out. And honestly, he seems way too enthusiastic for someone just chasing a feather. He keeps glancing back at the castle, making sure everyone is watching him stride into destiny. You know the type. The guy who jogs in the park but looks over his shoulder every 30 seconds to check if passersby are impressed by his running form? Yeah, that's him. His feather, the golden one, drifts across fields that smell faintly of hay and distant wood smoke. It gleams in the sunset like a coin tossed carelessly across the sky. He sees it as a promise, wealth, grandeur, something fit for a king. After all, isn't gold always the prize? That's how he's been raised to think. But here's the thing. Folklorists note that gold in fairy tales isn't always a blessing. Sometimes it corrupts, sometimes it blinds, and sometimes it turns out to be fool's gold. Scholars still debate whether these golden symbols were intended as warnings about greed or just shiny objects to keep listeners entertained. Either way, the eldest prince doesn't care. In his head, he's already wearing the crown. He crosses a small village where farmers pause to watch. He waves regally, even though they're mostly just wondering why this royal is chasing a feather instead of, governing. One farmer mutters something about kings and their strange hobbies, while his cow loudly agrees. Okay, the cow just mooed, but the timing was suspiciously judgmental. By the time he reaches the feather, it has landed near a merchant's stall. The merchant, rubbing his hands, recognizes easy prey when he sees it. The prince demands something impressive, something he can carry back to his father as proof of worth. The merchant obliges, of course. Out comes a golden goblet, polished so brightly it nearly blinds him. Fit for a king, the merchant says. Which is probably true, though it's also fit for anyone with a purse fat enough to buy it. And here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval courts were notorious for gaudy objects like this. Gilded cups, jewel-encrusted spoons, even entire salt shakers shaped like miniature castles. Archaeologists still argue about whether these items were ever practical, or if they were just power statements, like a medieval version of buying a sports car you can't park anywhere. The eldest prince beams, clutching the goblet like it's already proof of his victory. He imagines walking into the throne room, handing it over, and hearing the court gasp. He doesn't notice that the feather, now limp and dull, lies forgotten at his feet. Because for him, the quest was never about the journey, just the trophy. The sun dips low, shadows stretch long, and you can almost hear the smug narration he's rehearsing in his head. "Behold, father, I bring you gold, the true symbol of kingship." And somewhere, unseen, the feather seems to sigh, as if it already knows how this story will play out. It's funny how often fairy tales use characters like him. Bold, brash, certain. And yet, time after time, their treasures end up feeling shallow.
Folklorists can't quite agree if these characters were meant to warn listeners or if they were simply comic relief for peasants who enjoyed laughing at the pompous rich. Maybe both. For now, though, the eldest marches proudly homeward, convinced he's sealed his fate. His goblet glitters, his head is high, and you can't help but wonder if that feather might still have more to say.
The middle prince sets out the next morning with a swagger that could probably be heard 3 villages away. If his eldest brother was all stiff pride and solemnity, this one is more like a walking festival, laughing too loudly, humming a tune that doesn't quite have a melody, and tossing winks at every bird, squirrel, and startled villager he passes. He follows the silver feather, which gleams in the cool dawn like a ribbon of moonlight drawn across the sky. He calls it a sign. Of course he does. Silver, to him, means charm, admiration, maybe even a few ballads written in his name. He imagines taverns singing of his adventures before he's even had any. If the eldest is chasing wealth, the middle son is chasing applause. Folklorists love pointing out how middle children in stories often play the fool, not quite wise, not quite cruel, but usually showy. Some scholars argue that these characters reflect real family dynamics in old European households, where the middle son often had to carve out identity between inheritance and obscurity. Others insist it's just comic balance, the loud one contrasting the quiet one. Either way, this prince fits the bill perfectly. The feather guides him to a bustling marketplace. Stalls overflow with bolts of fabric dyed in impossible colors, spices that sting your nose even before you taste them, and trinkets that glimmer with a promise of mystery. He announces himself with a clap of his hands, as though the market should pause to admire his arrival. And honestly, some people do pause, mostly because they're confused about why this stranger is loudly declaring he's on a feather quest. A merchant, sly-eyed and quick-tongued, senses opportunity. The prince demands a marvel, something that will dazzle the court into declaring him heir. The merchant unveils a silver flute, gleaming as if polished by starlight itself. It's beautiful, it's expensive, and it looks very impressive when the prince holds it aloft. Quirky tidbit here, silver instruments were actually crafted in Europe, though rarely played. Too delicate, too costly, and often more ceremonial than musical. Some even doubt whether they made any sound at all. Historians argue whether these objects were meant as genuine instruments or just conversation pieces, like the medieval equivalent of displaying a guitar you can't play in your living room. The prince tries the flute, puffing his cheeks like a goose with stage fright. The sound that emerges is questionable, somewhere between a sneeze and a goose honk. He laughs it off, of course, spinning it as a new style of music the court will love. You have to admire the confidence, or at least the denial. He cradles the flute proudly, imagining his father dazzled, his courtiers whispering, and his future subjects applauding every note. Never mind that he can't play it. To him, appearance is everything. He doesn't notice how the feather, now dulled to gray, slips from sight, as if it too has given up. Folklorists still debate if this part of the grim tale was meant to mock vanity, how some people confuse shiny surfaces for substance. Or maybe it was just meant to make listeners chuckle at the prince who could blow a flute and summon only angry ducks. Either way, the middle son struts back toward the castle, silver flute in hand, convinced the crown has already tuned itself to his key.
The quiet son lingers at the castle gate long after his brothers have vanished into the horizon. Their laughter and boasts fade until only the hush of evening crickets remains. You trail beside him, watching how he doesn't rush, doesn't frown, doesn't even look disappointed that his feather refused to take flight. Instead, he studies it where it rests, pale against the stones, as though it's trying to whisper something only patience can hear. This prince has always been overlooked. In fact, in the original Grimm telling, he's nicknamed the Simpleton, though scholars argue about what that word really meant. Some suggest it was just an old-fashioned way of calling someone slow or foolish, but others believe it carried softer undertones, maybe innocent or pure of heart. Folklorists can't quite agree if he was meant to be laughed at or admired. You suspect it's both. After all, fairy tales thrive on contradictions. He kneels, fingers brushing the feather, and notices how it shivers ever so slightly. Not in the wind, there is no wind now, but in a way that feels deliberate, guiding. You lean closer, and sure enough, the feather edges toward a crack between the cobblestones. The prince tilts his head. His brothers would have scoffed, declared it useless, stormed off in search of something grander. But not him. He crouches lower, pressing his ear against the stone, and, believe it or not, he hears something. A faint hum, like the purring of a cat behind a closed door, or the sound of your phone vibrating under a pillow at 3 a.m. Soft, insistent, almost comical if it weren't so strange. He doesn't hesitate. He fetches a lantern, lifts a trapdoor nearby, and begins descending the narrow stone steps curling beneath the courtyard. Quirky tidbit, many castles in Europe really did have secret tunnels and chambers beneath their courtyards. Some were escape routes, others storage cellars, and a few were downright mysterious, sealed off with no records explaining why. Archaeologists still debate whether these spaces were practical or symbolic, built for ritual or defense. The Grimm brothers, hearing villagers whisper about hidden doors in old ruins, may have simply woven the mystery into their tales. The prince's lantern casts shadows that wobble across damp stone walls. The air smells of moss, earthy and cool, like the ground after a summer storm. You follow him downward, and with each step, you sense the feather still pointing, urging him deeper. He doesn't complain, doesn't sigh, doesn't mutter about dirt ruining his boots. He simply listens, patient as always, to the silent guidance. At the bottom of the stairs, he discovers an arched door. It's smaller than you'd expect, as if built for someone half his size. And carved into the wood is a symbol, 3 feathers overlapping, their tips pointing in different directions. He runs his hand across it and smiles, softly, not with triumph, but with quiet recognition, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. Historians still argue whether this moment in the tale is meant to suggest fate or choice. Did the feather already know where it wanted to land, or did the prince make meaning out of what others ignored? Folklorists lean toward the latter. The youngest succeeds because he notices what others overlook, not because destiny hands it to him. He pushes the door open, and the smell of damp moss grows stronger. A hush falls, deep and complete, as though the world above has vanished. And somewhere in the shadows, something shifts. You can't quite tell if it's a rustle, a sigh, or the start of a conversation. The feather glows faintly in his hand, and for the first time you realize this quiet path, this unremarkable, humble descent, might be the beginning of the most extraordinary discovery of all. The air inside the underground chamber clings to your skin, cool and damp, like the inside of a cave after rain. The prince holds up his lantern, its flickering light stretching shadows long and thin across the stone walls. You notice something peculiar. The moss here isn't just green. It shimmers faintly, as though silver threads are woven through it. You half expect it to hum like neon lights. And then it happens. A whisper, soft, almost like someone trying out a secret in the wrong key. The prince freezes. You lean closer, straining your ears, and the sound brushes against your thoughts more than it reaches your ears. It's not words at first. It's more like a sigh, a melody of breath. But gradually, It shapes itself, follow deeper. He sets the feather against the moss, and it glows brighter, pulsing gently in time with the whisper. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't call for guards. He simply nods, as if he'd been expecting this. It's both eerie and oddly comforting, like discovering your GPS has feelings, but only uses them to suggest scenic routes. Folklorists often point out how whispers and hidden voices in tales serve as liminal guides. They're not gods, not demons, but something in between, helpers who blur the line between natural and supernatural. Some scholars insist these voices come from remnants of older pagan traditions, the echoes of local spirits. Others believe they're narrative devices, cheap tricks to spook and delight children. And then there's the debate about whether the Grimm brothers themselves added these whispers or simply recorded them as villagers told them, half in jest, half in faith. Quirky tidbit: in certain German folk tales, moss itself was thought to carry memory. Travelers would swear moss pointed north, or that patches of moss remembered footsteps and grew thicker where people often walked. Botanists, of course, roll their eyes at this. But still, the idea of moss as an old-world archive lingers. The prince follows the whispering moss along a tunnel that twists like a forgotten riverbed. At times, the passage narrows so much he has to duck, brushing cobwebs that cling to his hair like stubborn confetti. You trail behind, wondering if the moss might suddenly start telling jokes. It wouldn't feel out of place. Finally, the tunnel widens into a circular chamber. In the center, a pool of water gleams, perfectly still. The moss along its edges glows brighter, and the whisper returns, clearer now. Seek beneath the surface. The prince kneels. The water mirrors his face, calm and unbothered, as though it's been waiting centuries for someone like him. He dips a hand in, and instead of ripples, the surface shifts like silk, parting to reveal a faint glimmer beneath. Historians still debate the meaning of water in stories like this. Is it purification, a threshold, or simply a convenient hiding place for magical objects? One scholar joked that storytellers probably just like ponds because they were plentiful and dramatic. Whatever the case, in this tale, the water feels like both a mirror and a doorway. The prince reaches deeper, his arm vanishing up to the elbow, then the shoulder. He doesn't panic, he doesn't struggle, he simply trusts. And when he pulls his hand back, it cradles something small, damp, and alive. You blink, because nestled in his palm is a frog. Not gold, not silver, not jewels. Just a frog. Its skin glistens like polished stone, and its eyes glow faintly like embers hidden in moss. And before you can laugh at the absurdity, the frog croaks, and then speaks. "About time," it says, voice scratchy but amused. "Do you know how long I've been waiting down here? Eternity doesn't even cover it." And just like that, the whispering moss falls silent, because the story has found a new voice.
The frog blinks slowly, as if it's sizing you up. Its eyes glow amber in the lantern light, the kind of glow you might expect from a campfire you didn't start. The prince, still kneeling by the pool, tilts his head politely, as though being addressed by a frog is just another Tuesday in his quiet life. "Well," the frog says, stretching its limbs with a wet plop, "you've got two choices. You can scream, run away, and I'll go back to sulking under this pond for another century. Or," it croaks dramatically, "you can listen." The prince doesn't scream. He doesn't run. He simply nods, The way you nod when someone offers you a sample at the grocery store and you're too polite to decline. His calmness unsettles the frog, who mutters something about humans usually flailing by now. Folklorists love frogs in stories. They're liminal creatures, half in water, half on land, existing between worlds. Scholars debate whether they were meant as symbols of fertility, transformation, or just funny little guys storytellers used for comic relief. One theory suggests frogs became magical helpers because their sudden croaks in the night spooked villagers who assumed they must be delivering omens. Another insists frogs were linked to goddesses in pre-Christian myths, carrying wisdom disguised in slime. Quirky tidbit: in medieval bestiaries, frogs were sometimes painted wearing tiny crowns, a bizarre artistic flourish meant to mock greedy kings. Historians still puzzle over whether these drawings were satire, allegory, or just bored monks doodling amphibian royalty. Back in the chamber, the frog hops closer, landing neatly on the prince's knee. "Here's the deal," it says. "Your father set a test. Bring back the finest treasure," he said. "Your brothers, they'll return with glitter and noise, but real treasures—" The frog pauses, puffing out its throat. "Real treasures hide, and I'm offering you one." The prince raises an eyebrow. "And what would that be?" The frog snorts. "Patience. You don't unwrap a gift before you even agree to take it. First, a bargain. Carry me with you, and when the time comes, I'll help you. Ignore me, and I'll happily go back to making snarky comments to Moss." The prince considers, and here's where scholars argue endlessly. Was this moment meant to test humility, to show that wisdom comes in the most unlikely forms, or was it simply a fairy tale trick, a way to amuse listeners before the big reveal? Some folklorists suggest the frog itself may have once been a goddess figure, reduced to comic size by centuries of retelling. Others think kids just found talking frogs hilarious. The prince doesn't hesitate long. He cups the frog gently, like a fragile lantern, and tucks it into his cloak. "I'll listen," he whispers. The frog croaks, sounding suspiciously like laughter. "Good choice. And don't worry, I'm more house-trained than I look." As you leave the chamber, the moss dims, its whisper fading into a satisfied hush. The feather in the prince's hand glows softly as though pleased. You can't help but think, while his brothers chase shine and applause, the quiet son has chosen something that most would dismiss as worthless. And yet, in fairy tales, it's always the small, strange bargains that change everything. By the time the brothers return to the castle courtyard, the air hums with expectation. Courtiers lean from balconies, servants whisper in corners, and the old king sits slouched on his throne, pretending his joints don't ache as badly as they do. You can almost hear him muttering, "This better be worth the effort, or I should have just let the crown gather dust." The eldest son marches in first, chest puffed out like a rooster in new feathers. He unveils his treasure, a chest brimming with gold coins, glittering so brightly that one servant nearly faints. The courtiers gasp and murmur. The eldest beams, soaking in their awe as though applause itself were part of his prize. Next, the middle brother arrives with his silver flute. He holds it aloft dramatically, as though he's about to conduct the dawn. With great ceremony, he blows into it. The sound that bursts forth is, well, let's call it unique. Somewhere between a hiccup and a donkey clearing its throat. A few servants clap politely, though one footman in the back covers his laughter with a cough. The middle prince bows anyway, convinced the flute's shine outweighs its unfortunate honk. "It's an instrument of destiny," he declares,
and honestly, you have to admire his commitment to the bit. Folklorists note how these returns always feel like a comedy of contrasts. Glitter, noise, pride. Scholars argue whether this structure is a moral lesson, don't be fooled by appearances, or just good storytelling rhythm. One tidbit: in early oral versions, treasures were sometimes swapped. One son brought a tapestry, another a jewel, another a sword. The pattern mattered more than the specifics. 2 flashy failures, 1 quiet success. And then comes the youngest. His steps are unhurried, his cloak slightly damp from that underground chamber. The courtiers whisper. Some smirk, expecting him to produce nothing more than a pebble or a soggy feather. But he reaches into his cloak, and out hops the frog. It lands on the stone floor with a plop, blinks once, and clears its throat. The room falls silent. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present myself as Exhibit A, your real treasure. Gasps ripple through the hall. Someone drops a tray of goblets. The eldest prince sneers, the middle one bursts out laughing, and the king rubs his temples, muttering something about headaches. But the frog isn't finished. It hops toward the throne, every move deliberate, like a lawyer pacing before a jury. Shiny coins tarnish, silver flutes squeak, but wisdom is worth carrying. It fixes its glowing eyes on the king, and I've got plenty of that. Quirky tidbit: some folklorists insist this scene hints at an older archetype, the animal bride or groom, where wisdom and magic are bound up in creatures dismissed as lowly. Others claim it's a parody of courtly trials, mocking how rulers valued glitter over substance. Historians can't agree, but nearly everyone admits the image of a frog giving a courtroom speech is unforgettable. The courtiers whisper feverishly. The eldest clenches his fists. The middle one tries to drown his embarrassment by tooting another painful note on his flute. And the youngest? He simply stands quiet, letting the frog speak for him. Because sometimes the cleverest choice is not to outshine your rivals, but to let the most unexpected voice shine in your place.
The hall grows tense, so tense you could probably hear a pin drop, if the middle brother weren't still tooting that flute like a goose stuck in a bagpipe. The frog sighs, hops onto the king's table, and smacks the flute out of tune with one swift kick. "Thank you," it croaks. "Some of us are trying to be taken seriously here." The courtiers chuckle nervously, though most still stare at the frog as if it were a prank come to life. The eldest brother, face red as a boiled beet, waves at his chest of gold. "Father," he declares, "surely the kingdom deserves a ruler who can command such wealth. This frog is an insult." But the frog is ready. "An insult? Let me show you what insults look like." It waves one slimy hand dramatically, and suddenly the gold in the eldest's chest grows dull. The coins blacken, crumbling into ash that scatters across the stone floor like sand through a broken hourglass. Gasps echo. Someone faints, not dramatically, but with the quiet thud of a person whose entire gossip network just collapsed. The frog swivels toward the flute. "And you? Ah, yes, the maestro of barnyard noises." It gestures, and the silver flute gleams brighter. The middle brother grins, but when he raises it to play, nothing comes out. Not a honk, not a squeak, just silence. The frog cocks its head, because sometimes silence is better than noise. The king leans forward now, eyes narrowing. You can see a flicker of curiosity beneath his weariness. He's not laughing anymore.
He's not even rubbing his temples. He's intrigued. The youngest prince doesn't boast, he doesn't gloat, he simply lets the frog work, his quiet presence steady as candlelight. And then, finally, he kneels and lifts the feather that led him here. This, he said softly, wasn't about finding what shines loudest. It was about finding what endures. The feather glows faintly, filling the hall with a pale, calming light. It's not blinding, not gaudy, just steady, like moonlight on still water. The frog hops beside it, eyes glowing the same hue. A king should be like this, the frog says, not loud, not fragile, but steady. Folklorists often note how this part of the tale sneaks in moral philosophy. Was the frog a test of humility? Was the feather a symbol of fate? Or were these simply props in a story meant to entertain long winter nights? Scholars can't agree, but they do agree that the youngest prince's gift is always the most understated, yet always the most meaningful. Quirky tidbit. In some versions of the story, the youngest doesn't bring a frog at all, but a magical carpet or a tiny ring that grows into something wondrous. Later retellings added the frog, perhaps because children in villages howled with laughter at the idea of a talking toad outsmarting arrogant nobles. Back in the candle-lit hall, the frog looks up at the king, waiting. The brothers fume, the courtiers whisper, but the air has shifted. The king strokes his beard, silent for a long while. And in that silence, you realize this isn't just about treasures anymore. It's about the crown. And the choice he makes next will decide who wears it.
The king leans back on his throne, fingers drumming the armrests like an impatient drummer trying to decide on a rhythm. The hall holds its breath. You swear even the tapestries are listening. Then he clears his throat and says, "Gold crumbles, flutes falter, but wisdom stays." The eldest brother leaps forward, nearly tripping over his own chest of ashes. "Father, you can't seriously consider a frog more valuable than this." He scoops a handful of blackened dust, only for it to slip through his fingers like burnt breadcrumbs. The court stifles laughter. He pretends not to hear. The middle brother chimes in, flute still clutched in his hands. "At least I brought something beautiful, something worthy of admiration." He raises the instrument dramatically, blows into it, and produces, again, absolutely nothing. A page in the back coughs politely, which doesn't help. The frog, lounging on the king's table now like a guest at brunch, flicks a drop of water from its skin. "Your sons are entertaining, I'll give you that, but a crown isn't a joke. It's not for whoever shines brightest, it's for whoever listens best." Its amber eyes flick to the youngest, who remains silent, calm, and, most importantly, unamused by theatrics. Folklorists often highlight this moment as the pivot of the tale. The test isn't about finding treasure, but about revealing character. Scholars debate whether the Grimm brothers added this moral clarity, or if it was already present in older oral traditions. Some argue the tale was once harsher, punishing the elder brothers more cruelly. Others say the frog itself may have once been a human figure, demoted to amphibian status as the story softened for children. Quirky tidbit. In certain 19th century retellings, the frog actually turns into a wise old man right here, unveiling himself as a disguised sage. In those versions, the king doesn't hesitate to choose the youngest. The frog's persistence across so many versions suggests audiences loved the idea that wisdom could hop out of nowhere and croak truth at pompous nobles. Back in the hall, the courtiers start murmuring, testing the idea aloud. "Perhaps the youngest truly is the heir," whispers one. "At least he didn't embarrass us with donkey music," mutters another. The tide shifts, subtle as a breeze. The king finally rises, slow and deliberate, leaning on his staff. His voice fills the chamber. "It is decided. My heir is the one who returned not with noise nor with glitter, but with patience, humility, and, apparently, a frog." The youngest bows deeply. The frog gives a triumphant ribbit, which somehow echoes like a choir. The eldest storms off, muttering curses at fate. The middle brother lingers, trying to blow a final note on his mute flute. Still nothing. And as the hall settles, you can't help thinking, it wasn't the treasure that won the crown. It was the quiet choice to trust the oddest guide of all.
That night, after the proclamation, the castle doesn't sleep easily. Servants whisper in the kitchens, knights polish their armor in silence, and even the torches in the hallways seem to flicker nervously, as though fire itself isn't sure what to think of a frog-shaped advisor. The youngest prince retreats to his chambers, the frog perched comfortably on the windowsill, croaking every so often like a metronome for thoughts. Moonlight spills across the floor, silvery and cool. You almost expect it to start narrating the scene itself. Moonlight has that kind of ego. "You realize," the frog begins, "this isn't the end. Crowns come with strings attached, responsibility, expectations, endless banquets where people argue over the salt." It shakes its head as though reliving centuries of bad dinners. The prince leans against the wall, unbothered. "I never wanted to be the loudest or the brightest. I just wanted to choose quietly." The frog chuckles. Quiet is harder than noise. You'd be surprised how much strength it takes not to shout. Folklorists love this moment of reflection. Many tales skip straight from youngest wins to happily ever after. But older oral traditions often included a pause, a moral aside, where the new heir shows his humility. Scholars debate whether these pauses were meant to instruct children or simply buy the storyteller more time while the audience refilled their mugs. Quirky tidbit: in some Danish variants of inheritance tales, the youngest prince doesn't reflect at all. He immediately throws a feast. The thoughtful pause may have been a later Grimm addition, designed to make their collection seem more respectable to middle-class readers. Back at the window, the frog suddenly yawns, a wide, theatrical yawn you wouldn't think possible for such a small creature. "Also," it mutters, "there's one small detail I may have forgotten to mention." The prince raises an eyebrow. "Which is?" With a croak that sounds suspiciously like a chuckle, the frog hops into the moonlight. Its body shimmers, edges blurring, and for a moment you wonder if you're seeing double. The damp skin seems to peel away, light swelling beneath it, until, blink, and where the frog once sat now stands a small, silver-cloaked figure. Not a frog. Not exactly human, either. Something in between. Something woven from moss, water, and starlight. You didn't just choose a frog. You chose me. And the room feels smaller now, more intimate, like a secret finally willing to speak. The silver-cloaked figure stretches, arms unfolding like branches reaching for dawn. It regards the prince with a smile that is half mischief, half melancholy. "Do you know," it says, "how many centuries I've been hopping around, waiting for someone to pick patience over pride?" The prince blinks, which feels like the only sensible reaction when your amphibian roommate suddenly upgrades into a star-draped being. "I suppose," he says gently, "you've been waiting too long." The figure chuckles. A few 100 years, give or take. Long enough that Moss started calling me a local legend. Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to be remembered as that weird frog who talks too much? You can't help but smile here. The humor cuts the strangeness like butter. Folklorists argue fiercely about this transformation scene. Some versions keep the frog as frog forever, a wise companion who never changes. Others reveal a hidden spirit, fairy, or even a cursed scholar. Scholars debate whether the Grimm brothers streamlined the ending or if they borrowed from animal helper archetypes found across Europe. One theory claims the frog was once tied to ancient water deities, stripped of grandeur over centuries until only a croaking guide remained. Quirky tidbit: in Norse sagas, enchanted animals often turned back into humans at nightfall, a trope mirrored here. But unlike most tales, this figure doesn't boast of being restored. They act almost wistful, as though the frog skin was both curse and comfort. Back in the chamber, the silver-cloaked being paces. Your brothers wanted crowns made of applause. You chose a feather, a silence, and me, which means you chose the harder road. The prince nods. He doesn't argue. He doesn't ask for rewards. Instead, he simply sits, resting his hand on the glowing feather still tucked into his cloak. Then I'll walk it. The figure studies him a moment longer, then sighs, soft as falling water. Very well. But remember, a crown is lighter if you wear it quietly, heavier if you chase its shine. The moon outside dips lower, painting the floor in softer silver. The room feels like it's exhaling. And somewhere, faint but sure, you hear the echo of a frog's croak, like the memory of patience still alive in the dark.
Dawn slides into the castle like a shy guest, pale light spilling across stone floors and chasing away the long night of whispers. In the great hall, courtiers shuffle nervously, unsure how to greet the day now that a quiet prince has been declared heir, and an ex-frog has joined the royal advisory board. The eldest brother sulks near the hearth, glaring into the embers as if fire itself betrayed him. The middle brother sits with his flute across his knees, still trying to coax out a note, muttering things like, "Maybe it just needs polishing," or "Perhaps it's a weather issue." Spoiler, it's not. The king enters slowly, his robe trailing, his crown resting lightly, almost reluctantly, on his head. He looks at his youngest son and the silver-cloaked figure standing behind him, and you sense the old man is weighing something heavy, like bread in a baker's hands. "This choice," he begins, voice gravelly but firm, "was not made lightly. A kingdom does not survive on noise, nor does it thrive on gold. It endures by the steady heart of its ruler." The youngest bows, but doesn't speak. Silence again becomes his answer, and oddly, it's the strongest answer in the room. The silver-cloaked figure steps forward. "Remember, Majesty, feathers fall where they will, sometimes on gold, sometimes on noise, sometimes on the quiet path." Historians debate this line endlessly. Was it meant to suggest fate rules all, or was it simply poetic flair that storytellers like to tuck in for dramatic closure? Folklorists argue that the feather motif is older than the Grimm retelling, perhaps connected to augury traditions where bird feathers signaled destiny. Nobody agrees, but everybody agrees it's haunting. Quirky tidbit. One 18th century variation replaced feathers with apples that rolled away to guide the suns. Imagine how different this story feels if the hero follows fruit instead of downy plumes. Less dreamy,
more slapstick. Back in the hall, the king straightens. His eyes sweep the assembly, landing last on the quiet prince. The choice is made. Let it echo through this kingdom. Crowns rest not on the loud, but on the still. Gasps ripple. Some cheer, others grumble. The eldest storms out, slamming the door like a child denied dessert. The middle brother tries one last heroic flute blast and manages only a squeaky wheeze. Even the courtiers laugh now, softly, almost kindly. And you? You can feel the weight of the moment settling like a feather itself, light but unforgettable.
The castle bursts into preparation for a feast, the kind that makes even the cooks groan with exhaustion and joy. Long tables stretch beneath velvet tapestries, golden platters groan under the weight of roasted meats and sugared fruits, and barrels of mead roll in like sleepy soldiers. The entire court, once doubtful, now hums with excitement, though you can still catch the faint sour notes of jealousy wafting from the corners, like smoke clinging to a cloak. The eldest brother is nowhere to be seen, likely nursing his pride in some drafty tower. The middle brother lingers at the edges of the hall, his mute flute balanced across his lap, as if silence itself were now his only song. Every so often, he tries a half-hearted puff, hoping the notes will return. Spoiler, they don't. The youngest prince sits at the high table, not puffed with pride, but watching everything quietly, hands folded. His gaze drifts often to the silver-cloaked figure who lounges in a chair with the satisfied air of someone who knows they'll never pay for a meal again. The feast begins. Torches flare, cups clink, laughter bubbles up, and for a while the tension lifts. The frog-turned figure even attempts a toast, raising a cup far too large for its slight frame. To feathers, it declares, for always falling where they're least expected. The hall erupts in laughter, though a few nobles exchange wary glances, as if they still can't decide whether to thank or banish the mysterious creature. Folklorists note that feasts and fairy tales often symbolize transition, the moment when order is restored and a new chapter begins. But in this tale, there's always an undertone, rivalry unresolved, brothers unhealed. Scholars argue whether that shadow is intentional, meant to remind us that peace is fragile. Others believe it's simply the nature of oral storytelling, where not every thread is neatly tied. Quirky tidbit: in Scottish folklore, some youngest wins tales end with the elder brothers turning into servants at the feast, forced to pour drinks for the sibling they mocked. The Grimm version softens this, leaving the brothers merely embarrassed, perhaps to make the story gentler for bedtime telling. As the feast wears on, musicians play, dancers twirl, and the air thickens with the smell of roasted herbs and honey cakes. Yet through all the cheer, you notice something. The feather still glows faintly in the prince's cloak, its soft light pulsing like a heartbeat. And you realize the story isn't ending at the feast. It's still drifting forward, feather light, toward a memory that will last longer than wine or song. The hall grows quieter as the night wears on. Torches gutter low, shadows stretch across the stone floor like long, tired arms, and the musicians pluck their final sleepy notes before slipping away. What began as a roar of celebration now dwindles into murmurs and clinking cups. The youngest prince still sits at the high table, posture calm, eyes soft, watching as the last of the feast fades into memory. The silver-cloaked figure leans close. "You've done well," it whispers,
But crowns are not stories that end neatly. They are rivers that keep flowing, carrying whatever drifts into them, branches, blossoms, sometimes even boulders. It taps the feather, still glowing faintly at the prince's chest. Remember, you chose this, or maybe it chose you. The prince doesn't answer with words. He simply lays the feather on the table, its light spreading gently across the hall, soft as breath on glass. Courtiers gaze at it in awe, though none dare touch it. It seems to belong only to him, and perhaps to the strange companion who guided him here. Historians still argue whether the feather light was ever part of the earliest oral versions. Some suggest it symbolizes divine right, a way of giving the prince legitimacy. Others believe it's just another motif borrowed from countless European folk tales, where glowing objects mark chosen heroes. Folklorists, predictably, can't agree, but they all admit the glow feels like closure. Quirky tidbit: in some rare French versions, the youngest prince actually sets the feather free at the end, tossing it into the wind, where it floats away to find another seeker. That version leaves the crown almost incidental. It's about the feather's journey, not the prince's. Back in the great hall, the king finally rises. He places his crown gently, not on his own head, but into his son's hands. The weight is real, but not crushing. Lighter, somehow, because it has been earned through patience. The courtiers bow, the brothers remain silent, and the silver figure fades slowly back into shadow, croaking once, softly, like an echo of all that came before. The youngest prince closes his eyes, crown in hand, feather glowing nearby. And in that silence, so much deeper than applause, you understand the quiet choice of a hidden prince.
And now, with the story's candlelight flickering low, you can let the last threads of the tale slip away. Imagine the great hall empty, the echoes of laughter dissolved into stillness, the torches snuffed one by one, until only the soft glow of that feather remains, steady, quiet, and unhurried. The kind of light that doesn't demand your attention, but simply waits, patiently, like sleep itself. You can picture yourself walking slowly out of the hall, down long stone corridors that cool with every step. The air grows softer, the night outside deeper, and above you the stars scatter like feathers themselves, drifting gently across the sky. Each one seems to whisper a reminder. Not everything loud or glittering is worth chasing. Sometimes the quietest choice is the one that carries you farthest. As you breathe in, the air feels like fresh linen. As you breathe out, your body sinks heavier, warmer into whatever space cradles you. The story lingers, but only faintly now, its edges blurring like a dream you've already half forgotten. The prince, the feather, the frog, they drift further into the distance, soft silhouettes walking away through fields of moonlight. And you remain, still and calm, with only the gentle rhythm of your own breath to guide you. Every exhale releases a little more weight. Every inhale welcomes a little more ease. There is no crown here, no decision to make, no hall of judgment to face, only the feather-light comfort of rest. So let yourself drift, as the castle fades, as the story folds itself closed. The night holds you, steady and patient. And sleep, like a quiet choice, is already waiting, already waiting, already waiting, already